We welcome you to another Sunday School lesson. Sunday School is a blessing and gift from God. Ezra tells the story of the Jewish people during the 6th and 5th centuries BC. In 586 BC, the Babylonians, led by King Nebuchadnezzar, laid siege to Judah, destroyed Jerusalem, and carried the people of Judah into captivity. However, the Babylonians' rule was short-lived. In 539 BC, the Persian king Cyrus destroyed the Babylonian Empire. By diverting the Euphrates River that ran into the city of Babylon, he was able to send troops in and easily capture the city and kill King Belshazzar. Cyrus demonstrated tolerance of the religious practices of his subjects. A notable decree written on a clay cylinder and known as the Cyrus cylinder, contained the command to repatriate exiled peoples and rebuild their houses of worship. The time for God's people to return home had arrived just as Isaiah had prophesied. This is where our lesson begins with the first group of returning Jews. Our first verse says, "In the first year of Cyrus king of Persia, in order to fulfill the word of the Lord spoken by Jeremiah, the Lord moved the heart of Cyrus king of Persia to make a proclamation throughout his realm and also to put it in writing." Cyrus, during his first year as king over Babylon, sent a proclamation, both verbal and in writing, throughout the Persian Empire, reaching tribes scattered in Assyria and Medes. He gave glory to the true and living God, saying that he had been called to build God's temple in Jerusalem. The Lord anointed Cyrus as a tool for his will, as foretold by Jeremiah. Verse 2 says, "This is what Cyrus king of Persia says, the Lord, the God of heaven, has given me all the kingdoms of the earth and he has appointed me to build a temple for him at Jerusalem in Judah." Cyrus recognized his rise to power and wealth had been divinely directed. He wanted to honor the many gods of the people of his empire. Ultimately, the exiles' good fortune did not come from a human ruler, but from the gracious God who oversaw the political movements of all the kingdoms of the earth. He acknowledged God's sovereignty as the creator of both the heavens and the earth, and proclaimed he himself would help the exiles build God's temple. Now that God's people were returning to Jerusalem, which is in Judah, proper worship would take place there. Verse 3 says, "Any of his people among you may go up to Jerusalem in Judah and build the temple of the Lord, the God of Israel, the God who is in Jerusalem, and may their God be with them." The decree did more than provide orders for the exiled people. It oriented their perspective of God who has not abandoned them. That God was in Jerusalem did not imply that the presence of God was limited to the city alone. Instead, it indicated that God was present to his people, especially in his house, the temple. It appears that Cyrus believed that the God of Israel was Israel's only God, and therefore, they were obligated to worship him only and particularly in Jerusalem. Verse 4 says, "And in any locality where survivors may now be living, the people are to provide them with silver and gold, with goods and livestock, and with freewill offerings for the temple of God in Jerusalem." Darius recognized there would be many Jews who prefer to stay in Persia and continue their already established livelihood. So he commanded these individuals to help the returning exiles by sharing resources for community building, including silver, gold, and livestock, for the economy and the establishment of the place of worship. A freewill offering was an additional gift to support proper worship in the house of God in Jerusalem. Those who choose to remain would be kind to the returnees because they saw that the government supported it. Verse 5 says, "Then the family heads of Judah and Benjamin, and the priests and Levites, everyone whose heart God had moved prepared to go up and build the house of the Lord in Jerusalem." While Cyrus issued the decree to rebuild the temple, it was ultimately God's plan that those whose heart God had moved, would return to build the house of the Lord. The heads of the tribes, consisting mainly of the fathers of the families of Judah and Benjamin, decided to respond. Ezra listed Levites alongside the priests and lay people, to return home and rebuild the temple. God's sovereign power generated both the king's decree and the people's response, despite the risks they have to take. Verse 6 says, "All their neighbors assisted them with articles of silver and gold, with goods and livestock, and with valuable gifts, in addition to all the freewill offerings." Even though they aren't part of the returnees, all their neighbors contributed generously valuable gifts to the cause. For many reasons they couldn't or wouldn't go, but would like to help those who did go. They may have decided to remain in their new land for economic reasons, but they aren't so materialistic that they refuse to help those who wish to return. Cyrus's commands were followed. This is an example of unselfish support of people who generously and willingly offered to the temple project. God can, wherever He pleases, incline the hearts of others to be kind to His people. Verse 7 says, "Moreover, King Cyrus brought out the articles belonging to the temple of the Lord, which Nebuchadnezzar had carried away from Jerusalem and had placed in the temple of his God." One sign of God at work is Cyrus's willingness to return to the Jews the Babylonians' hoard of temple treasure stolen from the Jerusalem temple before it was destroyed. For a rich king to part with treasure takes God. Verses 7 to 11 list all the expensive articles of silver and gold, which were kept and placed in the temple of his gods, perhaps at the temple of Marduk. By concerning himself with the sacred artifacts of his subjects, Cyrus acted as a pious king who honored all gods of his empire. Verse 8 says, "Cyrus king of Persia had them brought by Mithredath the treasurer, who counted them out to Sheshbazzaro the prince of Judah." Cyrus ordered Mithredath, the treasurer, to release the artifacts from the treasury. Cyrus designated Sheshbazzar, called the prince of Judah, as the responsible receiving party for the Jews. The term prince refers to a person in authority, not necessarily someone of the royal line. Sheshbazzar is mentioned as participating in laying the foundation of the temple. Verse 11 says, "In all, there were 5,400 articles of gold and of silver." Sheshbazzar brought all these along with the exiles when they came up from Babylon to Jerusalem. The vessels entrusted to Sheshbazzar consisted of utensils and resources made of gold and silver. Like many ancient temples, Israel's temple served as the treasury in which royalty and priests stored valuable materials. The mention of 5,400 vessels describes the relative wealth to be housed in the rebuilt temple. Temples were considered to be safe because ancient peoples believed theft would offend the temple's divine occupants. Ezra chapter 2 verse 64 says, "The whole congregation together was 40,2,303." The second chapter of Ezra begins by listing the family groups of exiles that returned to Judah and Jerusalem. The returnees were around 42,360 exiles who formed a family of the people of God, returning to their homeland in sufficient numbers to rebuild. Verse 65 says, "Beside their servants and their maids, of whom there were 7,337, and there were among them 200 singing men and singing women." The returning Jews traveled with 7,337 servants who might refer to indebted Israelites or to foreigners. The prophet Isaiah called on Israel to accept strangers, Gentiles, as servants, who loved God, kept the Sabbath, and adhered to God's covenant stipulations. In addition, they were joined by 200 male and female singers, who probably sang songs of Zion as the people traveled to Jerusalem. Just about 50,000 people came up out of Babylon to return to Israel. Verses 66 and 67 say, "They had 736 horses, 245 mules, 435 camels, and 6,720 donkeys." The number of horses, mules, camels, and donkeys indicates that most of the returnees walked the entire way from Babylon to Jerusalem. Only the wealthy rode animals, the rest of the animals were to carry the goods they brought with them. The resources the exiles had for their return was sufficiently provided by God. Verse 68 says, "When they arrived at the house of the Lord in Jerusalem, some of the heads of the families gave freewill offerings toward the rebuilding of the house of God on its site." Ezra records that once the group arrived in Jerusalem, they immediately gave offerings to God. What a celebration it must have been for this formerly oppressed people to be free to rebuild their culture. The very first step, they knew, had to be the temple. Many gave freely to the project, perhaps depositing the gifts that were given to them by those who could not make the journey. The chief of the fathers took on the responsibility to encourage their household to give toward the reconstruction. Verse 69 says, "According to their ability they gave to the treasury for this work, 61,000 darics of gold, 5,000 minas of silver and 100 priestly garments." The gold and silver formed an endowment for the work of reconstructing the temple and for the work of the priests. The elaborate garments of the priesthood were made of gold, fine linen, and precious stones. Because of the garments' value, they were counted as part of the temple treasury. Our last verse says, "The priests, the Levites, the musicians, the gatekeepers and the temple servants settled in their own towns, along with some of the other people, and the rest of the Israelites settled in their towns." Once the company arrived in Jerusalem, they returned to the towns and villages that their families had lived in, prior to the exile. The priests and Levites have assigned villages, as well as the other Israelites. The leaders of Israel's religious practice would stay near the soon-to-be rebuilt temple, but the others would begin to build a new life in the land. Freed from captivity. In this lesson, we see how God used Cyrus, the king of Persia, to fulfill a decades-old prophecy. Isaiah had prophesied that Cyrus, under God's direction, would allow the Jewish people to return to their own land and worship God as they should and where they should. Because he is sovereign, God can use anyone he wants to accomplish his will, and he normally does. Freed from captivity. 1. God can stir up the hearts of even kings to fulfill his purposes, Ezra 1:1-3. God is truly sovereign, he can do with a man whatever he well pleases. 2. When God sends us someplace he can use our enemies to help us, Ezra 1:4. So pray for your enemies, for as you pray, God will bless them. And in blessing them, you too will be blessed. 3. God will provide leaders to take us where he wants us to be, Ezra 1:5. We should follow Paul's exhortation to pray for government leaders, no matter what our personal political persuasion or how righteous they are. God is at work in the affairs of nations through them. 4. Man may use God's vessels for evil, but God can use those same vessels for good, Ezra 1:6-8. God's sovereign right as the potter, can do whatever he wants with the clay, and the clay has no right to challenge the potter. 5. If God promises to bring us where he wants us to be, he will provide for our needs, Ezra 2:64-67. There may be lots of things God will withhold from us, but he does promise to give us what we need in order to fulfill his purpose for our lives. 6. Those who love the Lord will give of what they have to the success of his ministry, Ezra 2:68-70. God wants us to honor him with our gifts. He wants us to be good and faithful servants by blessing others and building his kingdom. We are truly glad you spent time to learn this lesson with us. We hope you are blessed and may share these with somebody else. Thank you very much, have a great week, and God bless you always, dear brothers and sisters.